Welcome to Chapter 28, The Dissenting 60s. Some decades in American history just really stand out as periods of major change. As with the 1890s and the 1930s, the 1960s is one of those decades. From major government innovation to the counterculture that developed, the 1960s were a time when the whole world seemed as if it were turned inside out, and that's even though we had economic growth and rising standards of living. The decade began calmly enough with the Kennedy presidency. This charismatic young president had a beautiful family, and he was very popular, but he achieved very little of major importance in terms of domestic policy. He was also inconsistent in his civil rights policies. In terms of foreign policy, he strove to increase America's military power, especially in conventional weapons. He was humiliated by the failure of the Cuban exiles to retake that island from Castro in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Soviet leader Khrushchev thought he was weak, which probably led him to approve placing those nuclear missiles capable of reaching the United States on Cuba. Kennedy soon found out about these missiles, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis and a very tense 2 weeks when the world teetered back and forth on the brink of nuclear holocaust. Kennedy gambled with a naval blockade of Soviet ships bound for Cuba. Khrushchev removed those missiles. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 disheartened the nation and sowed cynicism as to who actually was responsible for the killing. Upon assuming the presidency, Vice President Lyndon Johnson wasted no time in fulfilling much of Kennedy's New Frontier agenda. Then, after trouncing right-wing Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election, Johnson used his own impressive legislative skills to push through many of his Great Society programs, which created what we know today as Medicaid, Medicare, and a host of other social programs ranging from Head Start to funding for artists. He also pushed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, pushed those through Congress. Between them, they used the law to eliminate most forms of discrimination in the United States. At the same time that major progress was made in civil rights, the activist Supreme Court was extending the scope of civil liberties through the judicial system. Legal protections for civil rights did not ensure actual economic, political, and social equality. It's important to keep that in mind. A militant Black Power movement arose around Malcolm X and later the Black Panthers as inner cities erupted into violence and destruction in the summers of 1966 and 1967. The actions of the moderate and radical wings of the Black civil rights movement sparked similar actions from Chicanos, Native Americans, and the LGBTQ communities at that time. The new feminism also blossomed as millions of women sought true equality and examined the nature of gender relationships in American society and in the world in general. Cultural values also underwent a radical shift in this time. This led to counterculture, a rejection of mainstream values by young people who turned to simpler lives, freedom of expression, rock and roll, sexual permissiveness, and drugs. Student activism also surged on many campuses. Students for a Democratic Society was a result of that activism, but it evolved into a radical leftist group that eventually splintered and lost a lot of its effectiveness. The 1960s was also the Vietnam decade. Lyndon Johnson started sending large numbers of American ground troops to South Vietnam in 1965, escalating the war and deeply involving the United States in that confrontation. As public opinion turned against his conduct of the war, and even his advisors finally told him the war was unwinnable, Johnson decided not to run for president in 1968. In the 1968 election, we had the assassination of anti-war candidate Robert Kennedy. Democratic peace candidate Eugene McCarthy lost the nomination to Vice President Hubert Humphrey. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, and segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace ran as a third-party candidate on his own. Nixon won by a narrow victory.